Good morning. I'm Roberta Eaton Cheadle, and today I am reading you a story called The Warning. This story is about the destruction of the Pink and White Terraces in New Zealand. Gratefully grasping the outstretched hand, Mary climbed down from the horse-drawn cart. "Ooh," she gasped. The overpowering stench of rotten egg, combined with exhaustion from the hours of uncomfortable travel, made her stagger unsteadily on her trembling legs. "I've got you," a comforting voice said. The helping hand had slipped up to her right elbow and gently supported her. "Thank you," Mary whispered, gazing into the intelligent brown eyes and lined face of the older woman. Such eyes, they probed into her being, burrowing through the layers of her illness and chronic pain and exposing her secret hope for a miracle cure. There was no resentment, pity, or derision in the woman's expression, only empathy and a reflection of her own yearning for a cure, or at a minimum, a better quality of life. "Welcome to Tawario. My name is Guide Sophia, and I'll be taking you to bathe in the healing water of the Pink Terraces once you've recovered from your journey." Her smile was genuine and kind. "In the meantime, young Jack here will show you to your rooms and help you with your luggage." Guide Sophia waved in the direction of a young, spotty-skinned lad with a friendly grin. Whump! Mary's suitcase thumped to the ground behind the cart. Closing her eyes, she briefly wondered if she'd remember to wrap her hand mirror and other breakables inside her towels. When she opened them again, the boy had manhandled her suitcases onto a pile. Mary's companion, Sarah, appeared at her side. Placing her hand firmly under Mary's left elbow, she staked her claim. "Thank you, Guide Sophia. I'll assist Miss Edwards from here. We appreciate your help." Mary smiled inwardly at Sarah's possessiveness. Her younger cousin took her role as Mary's helper and nurse seriously, and did not like any interference from outsiders. A warm bath and a long afternoon sleep left Mary feeling sufficiently recovered to descend the stairs with Sarah's help and join the other guests for dinner in the dining room. "May I escort you ladies to the lounge?" Mr. McRae, the proprietor of the hotel, asked when Mary and Sarah had finished their meal. Several of the ladies gathered there after dinner to enjoy a cup of tea and conversation before they retire. "Thank you, that would be lovely," said Mary, making a quick decision to meet a few of the other hotel patrons, despite her fatigue. After all, she thought, life is to be enjoyed, and I don't know how much longer I've got left. "Good evening, Mrs. McCourt." Mr. McRae guided Mary towards a middle-aged dowager with a pleasant face, seated in an armchair near the fire. He pulled up another 2 chairs and helped Mary to sit comfortably. Sarah took the other chair and smiled at the kindly gentleman. "This is Miss Edwards and her cousin, Miss Hamilton. They are planning to visit the terraces within the next few days. As you've already visited this amazing natural phenomenon, I thought you might like to share your impressions with these ladies." "Of course, Mr. McRae, I would be delighted to share my experience." Much to Mary's delight, Mrs. McCourt proceeded to tell them all about her journey to the terraces. "It's an arduous journey to get there," she said. "You have to cross Lake Tarawera by boat and then travel on foot over the mountain pass to the second lake. It is a 2-hour journey by canoe across Lake Rotomahana to the terraces. You leave early in the morning and arrive at the White Terraces at about 11 a.m. Mrs. McCourt looked carefully at Mary, her sharp eyes taking in Mary's yellowish complexion, thin face and scrawny body. There are invalids and people seeking to halt the ravages of time who travel to the terraces to bathe in its healing waters, warmed by thermal activities. She chuckled. That's one of the reasons I made the journey all the way from England. It's been worth it though, and I feel strong and well enough to start the return journey home tomorrow. I feel encouraged, Sarah, Mary confided to her companion as they climbed the stairs to their bedrooms an hour later. I know my father disagreed with my decision to come here. He thought the onerous journey, particularly the voyage by ship from London to Auckland, would further undermine my health. Despite his concerns, I'm starting to believe I was right to come. 7 days of relaxation and good food had improved Mary's looks. Her face, reflected in her small mirror, had lost the worst of its darkly yellow undertone, and even looked slightly fuller. I look less like a dried pear, she thought with pleasure. Taking life slowly during the period of rest and recovery, she'd gone for short walks with Sarah, gazing admiringly at the 3 imposing volcanic rock domes that comprised Mount Tarawera. The view was particularly stunning in the evening when the light of the setting sun caught the streaks of red oxide and glassy obsidian that threaded the rock. The Maori beliefs about the mountain intrigued her. Guide Sarah told her a bit about the sacredness of the mountain. Pointing at Wahanga, the most northerly of the 3 domes, she'd said, Wahanga is the ancient burial site for the Maori, and generations of our chiefs are buried in clefts and caves along its flanks. The mountain is tapu, or sacred, to my people. Money's ability to corrupt is a terrible thing, Mary thought, considering Guide Sophia's words in the context of what she'd seen during her short stay in the village, of the easy spending, alcoholism and prostitution among the local people. She'd attended a haka and Maori singing in the meeting house called a wapuni, and had been surprised that it was decorated with gold sovereigns instead of paua shells. On the surface, the usual restraints of religion seem to have little meaning here, but from what I've heard, many of the people are worried about the future and what it holds for them. Guide Sophia mentioned that there has been a lot of illness and death in the village lately, and that funerals have become an almost daily occurrence. Today she was going to see the sacred mountain and the magnificent terraces for herself, instead of listening to second-hand information shared by other tourists. Over an early breakfast of cooked oats, she and Sarah chatted about their plans for the day. They were ready to make the lengthy trip to the terraces. I'm looking forward to our journey to the terraces today. I've heard so much about them. Mary took a small sip of her piping hot tea. Sarah eyed her carefully, just as Mary imagined a scientist would examine some strange new creature under a microscope. Minor annoyance washed over her as she interpreted Sarah's behavior as a lack of faith in her ability to manage the journey. Are you sure you can walk from Ta'araki village to the other side of Lake Tarawera all the way to Lake Rotomahana and then sit in a canoe for 2 hours to be paddled to the terraces? Setting down her delicate china teacup, Mary was about to snap angrily at Sarah when a soothing voice answered, "She will be fine. I'll be there to help her, and so will you." Mary looked up into the calm face of Guide Sophia. "You are looking so well, my dear," the guide continued, "and the healing properties of the hot springs will do you so much good." An hour later, Mary and Sarah were on the boat, ready to strike out across the lake on the first leg of their new adventure. From her seat on the boat, Mary watched the village and the hotel disappear into the swirling banks of steaming mist that clung to the shoreline. Flocks of water birds flew out of hidden recesses and swooped across the sky. Joy filled Mary's soul as she enjoyed the freedom of the birds, flying with them in her mind's eye. It pushed aside the vague uneasiness precipitated by the strange happening of that morning when their group had arrived at the landing to find Waroa Creek dry and the boats beached on the mud. Watching, they'd seen the water surge up the channel with the moaning cry of a woman in pain, refloat the crafts and then drain away. The second time the water rushed down the channel, it remained, and the boat stayed afloat. Some of the group had wanted to cancel their day trip, but the Maori boatmen had persuaded them to continue. "Everything's fine," they said. "You've nothing to worry about." They don't want to lose their day's pay, Mary thought uncharitably. An hour later, the small boat was halfway across Lake Tarawera. The sun was sucking up the mist, and it was getting warmer. Mary was dozing when a frightful shriek of wind jerked her awake. It threw up a spray of water that whipped across her face, leaving her startled and wet. Seeking comfort, her bewildered eyes sought out Guide Sophia. The woman was intently focused on something behind Mary. Swinging around, Mary exhaled sharply and then shuddered. A Maori war canoe was bearing down on them. It lay low in the water, a lone paddler propelling it forward. Closer and closer it came. As it drew nearer, the canoe filled with warriors, strong men with the ferocious heads of dogs. A shriek escaped Mary's tightly constricted throat as terror and confusion seized control of her. She shrieked again, and then the canoe was gone. The water glimmered peacefully like a chastened child, unmarred by any boat other than their own. Mary sat in the boat, inhaling deeply and exhaling fully as she had been taught. Gradually, the dizzying sensation of overbrightness and ultra-sharp focus receded as the adrenaline drained and her nervous system relaxed. The semi-hysterical chatter of the other tourists discussing the peculiar behavior of the lake's water and the shocking appearance of the phantom canoe washed over her unheard. Concentrating intently on the gentle lap of the water, Mary gazed absently at the shore until the boat reached its destination and she stood again on solid ground. The walk over the Isthmus Pass to Lake Rotomahana was daunting for Mary, even with the unwavering help of Sarah. Her breath came in short gasps as she struggled upwards, sweat streaming down her pale face. Guide Sophia dropped back from time to time to encourage and praise her efforts. The sight of the gentle waters of Lake Rotomahana and the canoes which would take them the rest of the way was most welcome. She'd made it in spite of her father's dire predictions of failure. They had been in the uncomfortable canoe for what felt like hours before Mary began to get a clear view of Tatarata, the White Terrace. It rose in giant irregular steps from the lake, disappearing into a cloud of steam atop a great pool of boiling water. Overflow water cascaded downwards, creating an array of basins of different sizes and temperatures, all with gracefully rounded curves and incrustations resembling frozen waterfalls or plumes of hundreds of ostrich feathers. Mary and Sarah spent a wonderful hour carefully climbing about the silica formations and admiring the tiers of natural basins, while their lunch of potatoes and freshwater crayfish, called kura, was cooked for them. The strange gurgling, hissing, churning, and sighing sounds of the water, interspersed with the occasional cry of a water bird, enchanted them with its outer-worldly quality. Guide Sophia showed them a pile of steaming mud. "Do you see that pile of mud over there? It's been projected over 25 yards from the crater. That's quite unusual. It happened recently too, as the mud is still soft." In the early afternoon, Guide Sophia conveyed the tourists across the marshy lake Rotomahana to the Pink Terrace. Guide Sophia pointed out the tiny Poi Island. "Not many Maori visit the island anymore," she said, "but old Chief Rangihuia and some others like to camp there. They say that the hot ground and nearby pools ease their aches and pains." Mary's mouth fell open in amazement as the pink terrace came closer. From its white base it rose up in gradually darkening shades of pink until it reached the topmost primrose-tinged basin. A short while later, she and Sarah were seated in one of the thermal pools, enjoying the warm, silica-rich water. Closing her eyes, she sighed with pleasure. The tourists bathing in a neighboring pool were talking about the phantom canoe. Mary recognized Guide Sophia's voice. "I spoke to Chief Rangihuia about the apparition we saw on the water. He believes it means that a big war is brewing." Mary heard her words, but in her relaxed and lethargic state could not force her reluctant eyes open to discuss the matter further with the guide. Later, Mary would remember this conversation, but at that moment her pleasure in the beautiful environment and pleasant circumstances lessened its importance. Like a goddess in an ancient myth, Mary sat in her silica bath in a setting so awe-inspiring she felt sure her future thoughts could only be pure and ethereal, like those of an angel. The following week saw Mary in various stages of recuperation, from the difficult journey to the terraces and back. Complete exhaustion left her bedridden for a full 2 days after her day out. Slowly she rallied, and her strength returned, together with an eagerness to visit the terraces again. Despite the tourist season being nearly over, Mary decided to extend her time at the hotel and planned another excursion to the terraces, undeterred by Sarah's concerned protests about her health and the troublesome rumors that were circulating, particularly among the Maoris. "The local people are anxious," Sarah told Mary. Tohoto Akiri, an elderly man whom the Maoris refer to as a tohunga, has predicted that the phantom canoe we saw is a warning of imminent destruction of this area. He has said that the exploitation of the terraces as a tourist attraction with no regard for ancestral values has sealed its doom. What is a tohunga? Mary was concerned by Tohoto Arikiri's ominous prediction. She knew that Guide Sophia was also worried and believed that her time as a guide at Rotomahana was coming to an end. Mary had also overheard muttered predictions that the failure of the flax to flower during the summer meant that a big earthquake was coming. From what I understand, a tohunga is a spiritual leader whose primary role is to guide the people and protect them from spiritual forces. The tohunga ensure that the ancient customs of the Maori are observed, said Sarah. I also heard that Takuti, a Maori warrior prophet, told Chief Rangihuia that when he visited him earlier this year that he should leave Tawario. He said that something was going to happen, but he didn't know what. I'm worried, Mary. Mary nodded slowly. I understand. We'll do one last trip to the terraces and then we'll plan to return home. Despite her obvious worry and reluctance, Sarah acquiesced to Mary's wishes. Dragging open her room door, Mary ran out into the dark passageway. The carpets bucked and heaved as the wooden floorboards beneath them surged up in choppy rolling waves like the ocean during a thunderstorm. The walls of the second floor quivered, and Mary lurched forward, fighting to keep upright as the floor swayed sickeningly. Her outstretched hand felt the wall, and she balanced against it while propelling herself forward. Dark shadows emerged from other doors, conducting their own uncoordinated and jolting dance towards the stairs. Behind her, Mary heard something heavy thump to the ground. She didn't look back, too absorbed in maintaining her forward motion to acknowledge any additional threat. The low rumbling rose to a thunderous roar as she reached the top step and stumbled down the shuddering stairs, hanging on desperately to the teetering railing. Racing across the entrance hall, Mary burst through the open front door and stopped in wide-eyed horror. Mount Tarawera had split open, creating a huge and crazy mouth which spewed a stream of glowing red, fiery yellow, and ashy grey vomit into the sky. A thick blanket of pitch-black cloud unfurled over the lake, dropping great burning balls of flaming rock into the boiling water. A loud hissing, like 1,000 kettles all boiling at once, filled the thick smoky air. "Mary!" she heard a bellow over the cacophony of noise. "Mary, come back inside. It's not safe outside." She swung around and headed back inside the building, joining the ranks of anxious and solemn guests gathered in the hotel smoking room. Sarah spied her and gave a small shriek of joy. "Mary, I'm so glad to see you. I was so scared when I couldn't find you. Mr. Johnston wouldn't let me go back upstairs and look for you. He said it was too dangerous." Sarah's lips trembled and tears slipped from the corners of her red-rimmed eyes. For nearly an hour they all sat quietly in the cramped and stuffy room, waiting to see what would happen next, if anything. Mary's heavy eyelids drooped closed, and her head bobbed forward towards her chest. She dozed. The distant ongoing rumblings of the mountain penetrated Mary's sleep in the form of a terrifying nightmare, and an hour later she jerked awake. Opening her eyes, she peered around in the dark shadowiness as the memories of how she came to be there gradually returned. The gentle breathing of her fellow guests, broken only by a few snorts and snores, were the only sounds to disturb the eerie silence. Thwack! 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 Enormous stones were falling onto the roof and ground. Thwack! 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 The stones were falling all at once, smashing into the roof and causing the books on the shelves to shake themselves free and crash to the ground. The lamps and ashtrays on the tables rattled and shook relentlessly in the dimness which had suddenly become thick and close. Shuffling footsteps added to the confusion of sounds as someone, or possibly a few men, approached the brighter patches of the windows through which the moon shone. Splat! 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 Thick, heavy mud thumped onto the roof and squelched onto the hard earth. Sarah clutched Mary and hung onto her tightly. Mary could see her lips moving in silent prayer. Above them, the roof creaked and groaned under the weight of the assaulting stones, ash, and mud. "It's not safe here," a loud voice cried. "The roof's going to collapse." "Come on," Mary panted, her heart pounding. "We've got to get out of here." Adrenaline churned in her veins, giving her strength. Hauling herself to her feet, she ran to the doorway, pulling Sarah by her hand. A large armchair toppled over, blocking her path. She climbed over it, desperately dragging Sarah behind her. Mary and Sarah were standing in the reception area when the roof collapsed, burying the smoking room in hot mud and ash. "Line up in pairs quickly," the voice bellowed above the furore. Rough hands pulled her and Sarah into the fast-forming line. The owner of the voice, whom Mary now recognized as Mr. McRae, pointed into the swirling mudstorm. "Take this," he said, handing every person in the line a blanket. "Put it over your head as protection." Pointing at Guide Sophia's Wera, a traditional Maori house with a strong foundation, equal walls, and a pitched roof, he said, "Do you see that house? That's where you must go. When you get there, Guide Sophia will help you." Mary and Sarah reached the front of the line. Mary could clearly see Guide Sophia's Wera outlined against the glowing sky. A thick, dark column of smoke rose up above the mountain, broadening out into a huge mushroom shape around which chains of lightning flashed and crackled. Together, Mary and Sarah launched off the rippling veranda. Their feet sank into hot mud 4 feet thick, a sharp contrast to the bitter wind. Mary strained to yank her feet free, losing her slippers after the first steps. The stinking mud tightly embraced her feet, ankles, and calves, clutching at the hem of her long nightgown like frantic hands trying to hold her fast. A few minutes later, exhausted, covered in mud and freezing cold, Mary and Sarah stumbled through the door and into the relative safety of Guide Sophia's home. The air inside the wearer stank of smoke mixed with the sour stench of fear-induced sweat. The mud floor was filled with people, many of whom were sitting cross-legged and staring blankly into space. Mary and Sarah found a spot and sat down. Wrapping her thin arms around her bent legs, Mary rested her heavy head on her knees. Exhaustion overwhelmed her, and despite the discomfort of the hard floor, she closed her eyes and knew nothing more for a long time. When Mary awoke, it was 6:30 a.m. The area around the door was a hive of activity as the men took turns using Guide Sophia's gardening spade and fork to dig away the 2 meters of mud that had buried the wearer. How coincidental that Guide Sophia had a gardening spade and fork in her house, Mary thought. Once the doorway had been sufficiently cleared, Mary and Sarah summoned up their courage and stepped outside into a markedly altered landscape. Here and there, the ridge of a wearer roof, tops of trees and fence poles poked up through the thick mud. All that remained of the Rotamahana Hotel was a single clapboard facade. Its rooms, roof, and verandas were all gone and reduced to piles of rubble. The collapsed shells of European-styled buildings smouldered, thin tendrils of smoke curling upwards. Other villagers who had survived the night emerged from the broken remnants of their homes. They stood about in ones, twos, and small groups, their eyes shocked and dazed. Mr. McRae, accompanied by his 2 brothers-in-law and the survivors from the school teacher's house, approached Mary and Sarah, who were standing watching a group of other survivors prepare to leave. Unsure what to do next, Mary was relieved when Mr. McRae took charge. "We will have to make for Rotorua. It's the only inhabited place we can reasonably walk to." Mary and Sarah had some misgivings about seeking refuge at Rotorua during a volcanic eruption. "We'll go," Mary said, "but only if you accompany us. I just can't manage it on my own." "Okay," Mr. McRae agreed. "I don't think there's much chance of our finding any survivors among the ruins. I'm concerned there could be a reoccurrence of the falling stones and mud, and want to get you ladies to safety." The group set off, walking in the direction of Rotorua. Limbs aching with fatigue, Mary focused on putting one foot in front of the other. "Hello there," a voice called out. Mary looked up hopefully as a man with a buggy and pair trotted into view. "Thank God, I don't think I can walk much further." "Ted, it's so good to see you," Mr. McRae cried. "Have you come from Rotorua?" "Hi, Joe, yes. I set out from Rotorua as soon as it seemed safe to do so. What has happened at Tawario?" "It's gone, Ted. Everything's gone, buried under tons of ash and mud. We were escorting these ladies to Rotorua, but I would be grateful if you could drive them in your buggy. They are completely worn out from their experience." "Of course I'll do that, Joe. I'll take them to Rotorua and come back with more men and equipment to help you dig out survivors and casualties." Mr. McRae helped Mary and Sarah into the buggy, and they were soon on their way to the relative safety of Rotorua. The footman helped Mary and Sarah into the coach that would take them from Rotorua to Tauranga Bay, from where they would travel by steamer to Auckland. It was raining as the coach set off, passing firstly through the town and then through the bush that crowded the road on both sides. Gazing out into the grey rainstorm, Mary sat quietly, contemplating the events of the past few weeks. Mr. Ted Robertson had delivered Sarah and herself to the sanitarium in Rotorua, where they were both thoroughly examined and pronounced to be injury-free. Mr. Robertson will take you to the local hotel, the harassed-looking doctor had said. Refugees from Tawarua are starting to arrive on foot, and many of them have injuries and burns. We're going to need all our beds today. During the short drive to the hotel, it smote Mary's heart to see the straggling line of men, women and children who had walked all the way from Tawarua, entering the town. All of them were coated in mud, with matted hair and shocked eyes. At the hotel, she and Sarah had made use of the wash house and donned the fresh clothing that the hotel manager arranged for them. Too tired to eat, Mary drank a glass of milk before retiring to her comfortable bed. The following day, Mr. Robertson helped Mary to wire her father for money. Everything Sarah and she possessed had been lost in the eruption. The townspeople kindly assisted them with food and other essentials until the funds arrived. Knowing they were preparing for their return journey to England, Mr. McRae had visited them a few days previously to say goodbye. He'd given them the grim news of his own rescue efforts in Tawarua and those of the relief parties from nearby Ohenamutu. The devastation is widespread, he'd said. The wasteland of sticky volcanic mud and smashed trees you pass through during your flight from the village extends over a huge area. The small settlements of Mora and Ta'ariki have completely disappeared, and there are thousands of cattle, bullocks, horses and sheep who are going hungry. There have been some survivors dug out of the wreckage. I'm sure you know that Mrs. Hazard, the school teacher's wife, survived and is recovering here in Rotorua. Mary nodded, looking at him dry-eyed. She had no tears left. I heard that you and the two Mr. Birds managed to dig Mrs. Hazard out of the wreck of her home. Poor woman, she must be in a terrible state after losing her husband, nephew, and 3 of her children all at once like that. You are a brave man, Mr. McRae. Sarah and I owe you our lives, as do many of your other guests, who would have died if it wasn't for your suggesting Guide Sophia's Wara as a place of shelter. We are very grateful. Mr. McRae nodded in acknowledgement, but didn't say anything about his role in saving lives. He lowered his eyes and his mouth bowed downwards. Chief Rangihiua is also dead. He and 12 other Maori who were camping on Puai Island on the night of the eruption were buried beneath the mud. Guide Sophia said that he had offered her tapu honey collected on Mount Tarawera a few days before the eruption. She says that everyone who partook of this honey died in the eruption. Guide Sophia told me Mount Tarawera was tapu. She was concerned about the villagers' lack of respect for their religion and culture, Mary replied. I heard that old Tuhoto has also died. Is that true? Sadly, it is true, Mary. The Tuhanga was pulled free of the mud that buried his wearer 4 days after the eruption. It seems that several foreigners decided to recover his body and discovered him alive when they started digging. The old man shouted at them to go away and leave him alone, but they dug him out anyway. He was sent to a sanitarium in Rotorua for treatment. Despite the best efforts of the medical staff, he died on the 1st of July. The doctor said he had decided not to go on living. Mary thought about the ancient Tuhanga's dire prophecies and the calamity that followed. How very strange that he was so accurate with his prediction. The appearance of the phantom canoe in advance of this calamity is also thought-provoking. The rolling bush and thick greyness of the clouds outside the coach windows seemed to go on forever. As she gazed out through the steaming panes, her eyelids grew heavier and heavier until she fell asleep, dreaming about phantom canoes and the accuracy of elderly prophets. Thank you for listening.